Hi, everyone. Welcome to Tuesday Tea Time with Nancy. Will you let me know if you can see and hear me okay? And in the meantime, I'm going to share my screen. Just put in the chat if you can see and hear me. Here we go. Okay, I think we're good. I think I'm sharing correctly. If you can just let me know. Just take a second to make sure. If you're watching on LinkedIn, can you put a comment that you can see? Okay, Kyle, thank you. Yes, you can. All right, then we will get started. So our tea time, Tuesday Tea Time with Nancy today is, I want to talk about rare events and how we can use reliability centered maintenance to manage the impossible. Because there are a lot of things in our professional lives as well as our personal lives, things that we say will probably never happen, and they probably never will. But but we're using the word probably, which means that there is a chance that it could happen. So today I want to share 2 poker stories with you to talk about, to show you some rare things that can happen. And then I want to roll into reliability centered maintenance and how we can use RCM to help us manage things that probably will never happen, but could. Okay, so I want to start with this. I was in Las Vegas. I was playing in a poker tournament at the Aria. And I was reminded, while I was playing, I was reminded about protective devices, or you may call them safety systems. Those devices are systems that are intended to protect us when, in the event that something else goes wrong. In other words, the probably will never happen. So let's talk about 2 fun poker examples. Okay, I was not in this hand. So there are 2 players. There's a guy who had pocket kings in his hand. And can you put in the chat if you play poker? So that would be interesting for me to know. There's a guy in the hand who has pocket kings. So he starts with 2 kings, which is the second best starting hand. And then there's another guy in the hand who has pocket 5s. In other words, he's starting with a pair of 5s. Well, the king's hand, when he looks down at his hand, he's probably going like zippity doo dah, zippity a, because he's got the second best starting hand. So he raises. The guy with 5-5 in his hand, he calls. Now the flop, which is the community cards that you use your 2 cards, and you can play with any of the 5 cards that you want on the board, and whoever has the better hand at the end wins the hand. So look at this guy flops 9-5-5. He flopped quads, or in other words, 4 5s. Now in the poker world, this is an amazing, incredible hand. The chance of flopping quads is 0.2%. So the probably will never happen, but it gets even more probably will never happen. Okay, so now the player with 5-5, he goes all in, meaning he bets all of his chips because he has the stone cold nuts, which in poker language means at this point, he has the absolute best hand. So now the king player, he calls, of course, because, if you're sitting with pocket 10s and the flop is 9-5-5, that's in almost all circumstances, it's a no-brainer. You're going to call that. So the king player in poker terminology, he's drawing nearly dead, which means, he has a 99.8% chance of losing. So let's just look at this in terms of statistics or percentages. So at this point, the king player has a 0.1% chance of winning. Now the turn comes and it's a king, and everyone at the table, because if you play poker, these things are rare, but they happen. So when the king comes, everyone at the table just kind of goes, oh, because of course, if the guy gets another king, he's going to win the hand, but it's very, very, very unlikely. Well, look at what the river was. The last card came was a king, and this guy, the guy with the 5s, lost the hand, and this knocked him out of the tournament. Now, if you play poker, it's this sinking, awful feeling in your stomach when you have the absolute best hand and you're like nearly guaranteed at winning, and this guy goes runner for king. So so here's the first example of the impossible, the near impossible happening that happened. So now I want to share the other event that happened. This time I was playing at the Venetian in Las Vegas, and I was maybe like 3/4 of the way through the day. So we had already played maybe about 7 hours, and I was playing really well. Now, stereotypically, women at the poker table are stereotypically passive and stereotypically will back down if, if I bet and someone raises, I'll get all scared. So anyway, in a poker tournament, as people get kicked out, they have to balance the tables, which means they'll eventually close one table and move those players into the empty seats in the other tournament. So the idea is, only one person can win. So I get moved to this table, and it's my very first hand. So I raise with ace jack of hearts, which is what I'm holding down here. I raise with ace jack of hearts. And it gets to this guy over here in this seat, and he re-raises me. So now I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, okay, this guy is just trying to make a play. I'm a woman. I just moved to the table. He has more chips than I do. He's just trying to make me fold and get my chips. Now, ace jack of hearts is a good hand, but it's a tricky hand to play, and there are so many other hands that beat you. But I had it in my mind that this guy was just out to bully me and get my chips. So I go all in. Now, this guy has ace king of clubs. Now, ace king of clubs is like the second or third, it's the third best starting hand in poker. A suited ace king is really strong. So he calls my all in and he turns over his ace king of clubs. And I'm like, oh, I'm so disgusted with myself because I'd played for 7 hours. I had played well. I had built my chip stack up. And the thing about poker is you can play for hours and hours and hours really well. And just in one moment, if you make the wrong move, or even if you make the right move, it can just all fall apart. So now I'm like, oh, he wasn't trying to make a move on me. I was wrong. I had it in my head that he was bullying me. So, okay, I start to, gather my stuff up because I think I'm going to be knocked out. And the dealer burns the first card, counts out the 3 cards face down, and then puts out the flop. And the dealer puts out King 10, Queen of Hearts. I flopped a royal flush, which is the stone cold nuts in poker. In other words, there's absolutely no hand that is better in poker. And I flop it. Now, keep in mind that flopping a royal flush in poker is a 1 in 650,000 chance. So it's impossible. The quotes mean it's like near impossible. So now when I flop this, poker is a very emotional game. This guy goes nuts. And so when the flop comes, everyone at the table just screams, oh, and like, people in the poker room start flocking over to our table to see, what happened, what's going on. And this guy, he goes nuts. He starts yelling and he starts berating me. You made the dumbest move. Ace Jack is a terrible hand. You overplayed your hand, da da da. And I mean, he was right that I overplayed my hand, but my read or my assumption is that he was trying to bully me. He was bluffing me. So from that perspective, I'm fine with what I did. But he just got really angry. And anyway, so I doubled up. I had a mountain of chips. I went on. I didn't win the tournament, but I went pretty deep and I cashed for like 3 times more than my buy-in was. So it was good for me. Afterwards, after the emotion of the game settled down, like 5 or 10 minutes later, he came back over to me and he apologized for what he said. And, I said, that's okay. It's a very emotional game. But anyway, it's a fun story to illustrate what can happen in the real world. And when it happens at the poker table, nobody's going to die. Operations are not going to be shut down for a month or a week or whatever because there was an unplanned failure and there was no safety device to kind of catch us. So both of these are good examples of that. And also how the guy reacted, he reacted very emotionally, very angry. He lost a ton of chips. And so how I can liken that in our world, in the reliability world, is that, we kind of get caught with our pants down when our machines fail. So now I want to talk, I want to roll into protective devices because the main focus is how we can use RCM to manage the impossible. And let me just say hello to Mauricio. You're coming in from Brazil. Thank you for joining me today. Mauricio and Kyle, if you can just put in the chat again, just to make sure you can still see and hear me, and you can see my slides and that everything's good to go. Okay, so let's talk about protective devices. So some people call them safety systems. In the context of reliability-centered maintenance, we call them protective devices. So when we talk about reliability-centered maintenance, we use two terms. We use the terms evident and hidden failures. So thank you, Kyle. Thanks for affirming that. Reliability-centered maintenance consists of 7 steps. And in the first step is when we write functions. We identify what it is we need our equipment to do. We generally start with a primary function, which is the main reason the system exists. But then we write secondary functions. And amongst those secondary functions, we write functions for our protective devices. Before we get into that, I want to draw the distinction between evident and hidden functions. So in the context of reliability-centered maintenance, an evident function means that failure of that function becomes evident to the operating crew under normal conditions. So for example, if the starter motor in my car is failed right now, when I leave to go to Pilates later today and I go to start my car and it won't start, well, it's going to become evident to me that there is a failure. I may not know exactly what has failed, but under normal conditions, I'll know it because my car won't start. The same thing as if I had a flat tire or if my battery was dead. These are evident functions because under normal conditions, I know it. It becomes obvious to me. But now let's talk about hidden functions in the context of reliability-centered maintenance. And remember, in the first step, we would write functions for our protective devices. So a hidden function means that the failure of the function is not evident to the operating crew under normal conditions. Let's take a simple example to illustrate this. Or first, let's just set forth the fact that protective devices, and a protective device is a device or system that is intended to protect us in the event that another failure occurs. So in the context of reliability-centered maintenance, let's consider a smoke detector. The function for our smoke detector would be to be capable of sounding an audible alarm in the event that there is a fire in the room. So you notice when we write functions for protective devices, there are 2 parts: to be capable of doing something in the event that something else goes wrong. So in the context of reliability-centered maintenance, our smoke detector is a protective device. It's a hidden function because failure of it is not evident to the operating crew under normal conditions. So if there's no fire in the room, that's my normal condition. if my smoke detector is in a failed state right now, but there's no fire in the room, I'm okay because I don't need the protective device. Now, you see how the smoke detector is a hidden failure because under normal conditions, I don't know it. But if there is a fire in the room and my smoke detector is in a failed state, now I've got a big problem. In the context of reliability-centered maintenance, this is called a multiple failure. So when we do reliability-centered maintenance, first of all, it is a proactive process. In the first 4 steps of reliability-centered maintenance, we create our FMEA, or our failure modes and effects analysis. We write functions, we write our functional failures, then we identify what specifically could cause functional failure, and then we write the failure effect, which is a story of what would happen if we did nothing to manage the failure mode. So you see, proactively, we consider and we analyze all of our protective devices. And when we write our failure modes, we write specifically what could cause failure of it. Like at home, in my home smoke detector, the battery could fail. And another failure mode is that my smoke detector could just fail. We'll just say fails. It's called a black box failure mode. It could fail electrically, right? Any part of the circuit, the detector, the processor, or the audible alarm, any part of that could fail. And any part of that could just fail at any time. It could just fail randomly. So you see, proactively, when we do reliability-centered maintenance, we identify these things. Now, the important thing about failure effects is that when we write them properly, it allows us to assess the consequences. You know, could someone be injured or killed? Could we adversely affect the environment? Meaning, could we breach an environmental standard, regulation, or law? Could we adversely affect operations? Or maybe it has non-operational consequences. I'm going to pause for just a second, and just if you have any questions or comments, do feel free to put them in the chat. With the app that I'm using, there's a 30-second delay. So just put your questions or your comments in the chat, and I'll definitely answer them. Varun, thank you for commenting. You're coming from Malaysia. Isn't that incredible that we have people from United States, Kyle, and Brazil and Malaysia, people from all over the world? Technology is really an amazing thing. Okay, so let's get back to this. I like to think about reliability-centered maintenance as a funnel, right? So what we do when we complete the first 4 steps of the RCM process, we complete an FMEA, or a failure modes and effects analysis. So a lot of times I get asked the question, well, should I do FMEA or should I do RCM? But one of the beautiful things about reliability-centered maintenance is that when you do it, you actually create an FMEA. So once we're done with the first 4 steps, then we take each failure mode that we identify in our FMEA and we put it through the RCM decision diagram. So that's why I like to think of it as a funnel. So we put, I'm looking at my camera over here, we put a failure mode one by one. We analyze each failure mode on its own separately. And what we come out with is a failure management strategy. We either identify a proactive maintenance task, or we identify a default strategy. A default strategy could be, hey, we need to change an operating procedure. We need to beef up training. It could be no scheduled maintenance. There are a lot of failure modes that, whether we realize it or not, we run to failure. And that's okay. If we're running it to failure consciously, that just means that the consequences are non-operational, or the consequences are so small that it's cheaper to let it run to failure than to try and do something about it. But another default strategy is what's called a failure finding task. Now, a failure finding task is a task that does exactly that. It is performed to see if a protective system is in a failed state. So it's not a proactive task because we're actually looking for a failure to see if it's in a failed state. Now, one of the things about if we do a failure finding task, let's go back to our smoke detector. How should the smoke detector be tested in order to check it in its entirety? You know, there are one typical thing that people do. You know, there's a button on your home smoke detector that you can push, and you can push it to see if the alarm will sound. But the thing about that is it's only checking that part of the circuit. It's not checking to see if it can actually detect smoke, process the fact that it detected smoke, and sound the audible alarm. So when it comes to our smoke detector, what we need to do is blow smoke at it. You can go to any hardware store and you can buy a spray can of smoke detector test aerosol, which simulates smoke, and it would check it in its entirety. In my house, I need to call an electrician, or if any of you out there have an answer for it, please do comment. The smoke detectors in our house are so sensitive that the smoke detector is maybe 8 feet away from the stove, but it's like around the corner and on the ceiling. And when I have my stove vent on high and I'm just browning ground chicken, so not even beef, like ground beef, that makes a lot more, not really, smoke, but the smoke when you're just sauteing, it makes a lot more than when you're just browning ground chicken. I mean, just last night it happened. I had the vent on full blast, and it still went off. And the reason I'm saying that is because it wasn't a planned failure finding task, but it was a failure finding task. But now here's the other thing. I just checked it last night when I was cooking and it worked. But that doesn't mean that it's working right now. So that's the nature of the failure finding task, is that you do it, but you have to do it at an interval that would give you the availability that you need. Let's talk more about that. Okay, so reliability-centered maintenance gives us very powerful tools for managing our protective devices. One of those tools is that we have failure finding task equations, where we can do an equation and we can calculate how often we need to do our failure finding task. So, because obviously the more often I do the task, then I have shorter intervals where I know that it is available. So some of the variables that go into a failure finding calculation is how often the protective device fails. So, or an MTBF, a mean time between failure. In other words, on average, how often would my smoke detector fail, right? How often the protective device is required to work. So here is another thing where I would have to figure out, so on average, how often would there be a fire? And the other variable is how often the organization is willing to accept the multiple failure. In other words, how often I'm willing to accept the fact that the smoke detector is in a failed state and there is a fire in the room. So calculating failure finding task intervals is another reason why it is critical that a trained facilitator lead an RCM group. You know, there are many failure finding formulas. For example, if you're dealing with cost, or if you're dealing with safety or environmental consequences, there are different equations. There are different equations depending upon how many protective devices you have. For example, with a smoke detector, that's just one. But in a really serious, in another environment, some organizations have more than one protective device in parallel. So just in case disaster happened and one of them was in a failed state, then there's another one to catch it. So there are different formulas for it. But facilitators are trained to know which formula to use to work with the RCM working group members in order to calculate the failure finding intervals. Because sometimes the variables that are involved, in fact, it's usually unusual that you'd have a database full with the kind of data that we need, right? Like, well, one of the variables is MMF, which, in other words, that's this one. How often we're willing to accept the multiple failure. That's something that organizationally, an organization would have to decide that. And then how often the protective device fails. Well, you can often get that from the manufacturer. You can sometimes just calculate it within a team with, if you've got an asset that's like 10, 20, 30 years old, you've got all that experience. You can calculate that for yourself sometimes. Also, how often the protective device is required to work. You know, in other words, how often has the primary pump failed and we've needed to use the backup pump. Usually that kind of data is not found in databases, but when you assemble a team of equipment experts and they've got 10 or 20 years of experience, you know, they can go back that long and say, well, you know, I've been working here 20 years and I remember that that's happened 5 times in the last 20 years. So you can calculate these variables. Oftentimes, failure finding task calculations, you have to do that way. Just like with other things in reliability centered maintenance, like figuring out P2F intervals and useful lives. Assembling a team of equipment experts is an excellent way to augment your historical data. Okay, so that's it for today's live. If you have any questions or comments, do, you know, put it in the chat right now. But you can also email me. The main gist of today's live, something that I just wanted to, that I know everyone knows, but we all need to be reminded from time to time that the impossible happens every day in our lives. And as responsible custodians, it's our job to proactively plan for those things. And one of the ways that we can plan for that is doing reliability-centered maintenance, writing functions for our protective devices, and then figuring out how to manage each one. If we're going to do a failure finding task, doing the calculation, figuring out how often we need to do it to get the availability that we are comfortable with for the protective device. If you're watching on LinkedIn, then we're already connected. If you're not, then I'd be delighted by a connection request. If you're a YouTube user, I'm 30 subscribers away from 1,000, and that's my new goal. So if you're in a subscribing kind of a mood, if you could hop on over to YouTube and subscribe. I also, I'm doing right now, I'm doing 100 days of reliability, and I'm posting. It's a challenge to myself. I'm on day 10. I'm posting a video every day for 100 days, So I'd appreciate it if you'd hop on over there. And I also post on Facebook if you're a Facebook user. You might be watching on Facebook today. Oh, Kyle, thank you for your 100 days program. Oh, Kyle, really? You look forward to seeing it each day? Thank you, Kyle. As soon as I'm done here, I gotta get busy on the next video. One of my goals is to get ahead so that I've got at least I'd love to get 3 days ahead, but so far I've not. It actually takes about 1 hour for every minute. So for every video that you see, if it's like a 4-minute video, that means I probably spent about 4 hours just recording, producing, thinking about it, getting my ideas down. So I really appreciate that, Kyle. Thank you. Mauricio, you are so welcome. Khalid, you joined us from Saudi Arabia. Thank you so much. So, yep. Thank you everyone for tuning in. I'll be back next week at the same time for tea time. I didn't even show my teacup. Tea time with Nancy. I actually have this really nice tea set right here. It's kind of out of the shot. And so my whole thought is I want to sit at my kitchen table and do Tea Time Tuesday with Nancy, but I had a technical glitch this week with I don't have the right adapter for my other laptop for the second screen, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, I'm getting better every day. We all are, right? Just keep trying, everyone out there. And I'll see you next week. So thank you very much for tuning in, and see you next week. Kyle, stay tuned for today's video, but it won't be posted till tonight. Bye, everyone.